If you would, turn with me to John chapter 20. On Friday, we gathered here and focused on the life of Christ being extinguished, and we demonstrated that by a series of candles that were connected to each of the final statements that Jesus made from the cross. And as a statement would be shared, a candle would be blown out until finally the Christ candle sat here in the middle of the offering table. And the words, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, was dead, were uttered. And the candle was blown out. And we heard that question in song, were you there? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? A friend of mine who happens to be here today shared something that I want to read to you. This is written by a man named Sean Gladding. I assume it's a man. I was right. It's called Jesus Obituary. You know, you'd think people would know that I'm preaching on Easter Sunday and they wouldn't call me. Hey, you remember that Easter when the preacher got a phone call in the middle of his sermon? Yep, that just happened. Jesus Obituary. Jesus of Nazareth passed away on Nisan 14th in Jerusalem. He is preceded in death by Joseph bar Jacob, who raised him as his own son. He is survived by his mother Mary, brothers James, Joseph, and Judas, and his sisters. Jesus of Nazareth was born in Bethlehem of Judea. His family fled to Egypt when he was 2, seeking political asylum. They returned to Nazareth in Galilee after the death of Herod the Great. Jesus was apprenticed as a carpenter to Joseph and worked in the family business until he turned 30. He was baptized in the Jordan River by the prophet John bar Zechariah, his cousin. He spent the next 3 years living as an itinerant rabbi with a small school of 12 disciples. He received the patronage of Joanna, the wife of Chusa, Herod's steward, Susanna, and many others. He devoted his life to serving the least, the last, and the lost wherever he found them. He proclaimed that the kingdom of God has drawn near and bore witness to it through liberating people from the demonic, from disease, and from the slow death of social exclusion. Despite our repeated warnings, his teachings, his work, and especially those whom he chose to call friends, inevitably drew the attention of the authorities. The family wishes to make it clear that his arrest and immediate trial took place without due process. The charges of blasphemy and of being a threat to national security were not corroborated by a single witness. He was humiliated and brutalized in custody before his execution by the state. He died as he lived, extending forgiveness to those responsible for his death. He will be greatly missed by his family, his friends, the sinners, and by the poor. The family wished to extend their gratitude to Joseph of Arimathea for covering his funeral expense. We tried to say that as well as we were able to on Friday night. That Jesus was dead. And that his loss was piercing. And it left a group of people bereft, unable to comprehend what it was that was taking place. And we find in this passage, the very beginning, Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene loved Jesus. She was devoted to him. And she had made an early morning trip to the tomb and found it empty and came back to report that news. And John and Peter make their way to the tomb. And it's interesting how John decides to frame it. Because a hurried trip soon turns into a foot race. And John makes plain that he won the foot race. It's almost kind of like boys will be boys. But John stops outside that tomb, and when he looks in, he can't seem to take another step. He takes note of the linen. Now, you may have heard a story that went kind of like this. When you ate a meal in a Middle Eastern home and you enjoyed the meal, you dropped your napkin in a wad on the plate. If you didn't enjoy it, you folded it up and set it down. Or you folded it up and set it down and said, "I'll be back." The problem with that is there's no corroborating evidence that that's the case. So if you hear that story, someone posted on Facebook, yes, it's cute, but probably not a tradition that anyone would have thought of or understood when they saw that linen. But here's what would have been understood. This isn't the first time that John has stood outside of a tomb. Because you see, in John chapter 11, that chapter begins with the news that Lazarus is sick. And Jesus is in no hurry to go to Bethany where Lazarus is. And his disciples are kind of confused by this. And finally, the word comes that he's dead. Jesus says, "Let's go." And they're like, "Why go now?" "Oh, you'll see." And they go, and Martha comes, and "If you'd been here, Jesus, you could have done something." And he says, "Well, do you believe I'm the resurrection and the life?" "Oh, yeah, I know, that's all going to happen one day." Sure, I believe that." Mary comes and just melts at his feet. Jesus wept in that moment, I think connected to the pain that he saw one of his own going through. But then he steps up to that tomb and he says, "Lazarus, come forth." But you know what they had to do? Two things. First of all, they had to remove the barrier. Secondly, they had to unwrap Lazarus. Mary finds a tomb. John can't even go into a tomb where the stone's been rolled away and the cloth has been folded up, rolled up, and set aside. And that's the clue that something more than a resuscitation has happened here. Peter, and you got to love Peter, because Peter is that guy that just dives in. Act first, think later, right? Some of us can relate to Peter. Peter loses the race, but in his mind, I'm sure he probably won because John stops and he goes right on in. And he goes into the tomb and he looks around and he doesn't know what to make of it. He leaves confused. John, however, finally, maybe emboldened by Peter's entry, he goes in, he looks around, and you see in verse 8 of chapter 20, finally the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, mind you, also went inside. He saw and he believed. So we've had two responses. One, without hesitation, has entered and left, still confused. Another has hesitated and then entered and believed, but we're told there in verse 9 that that wasn't a phone call. We're told there in verse 9 that this is an incomplete kind of believing. Because look what it says. They still did not understand from the Scriptures that Jesus had to rise from the dead. And they go back to where they're staying. But Mary who we don't know when she got there. We assume that she came in third in this race. Maybe she didn't participate in the race at all, but she's staying outside the tomb. John and Peter leave, and Mary's there on the outside, and she is racked by grief. It has so consumed her that when she looks inside the tomb and there are these two angels sitting there, that doesn't even penetrate the sorrow that she feels in that moment. You've got to be pretty broken to not snap out of that, at least for a moment, at the presence of two messengers arrayed in such a fashion. But it is not enough because she is so distraught. And all that she can think of is that a theft has occurred. Jesus' body has been spirited away by thieves. And then Jesus appears. And Mary, in her grief, can't recognize him as Jesus. She thinks he's just the gardener. She thinks perhaps he's someone that can answer this question that's been driving her up to this point. Where is my Lord? And then he does something. He does something that is so remarkable that we are tempted perhaps to fly by it. But look with me at verse 16. Jesus said to her, Mary. First name that Jesus spoke after his resurrection was not Peter, not James, not John, but Mary. Mary. And in that moment, with her name being uttered, she knows who it is that's standing in front of her. And she does, I think, what any of us would do in that moment. We got back the one we thought we had lost, and she grabs him up. And that makes what Jesus says to her next sound kind of harsh. He says, do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. I have trouble with this image, because were it me, I'd want to hold on just a little bit longer. I'd want to revel in that moment. And a grief so deep that even an angelic visitation could not distract it is hard to kind of deal with what seems like a rebuff. Yes, Mary, it's me, but we don't have time for this anymore. And suddenly we're faced with the fact that a resurrection appearance is much more than a reunion. A resurrection appearance becomes a commission. Mary can't hold on to Jesus in this moment because it's bigger than just what she has known up till this point. It can't be the way that it was any longer. The resurrection means that she's got to participate differently now in this life of faith. She's got a responsibility, and she becomes the first. You might call her the apostle to the apostles. She has to bear the message. She has to go back to them, and she has to say, as we see her do in verse 18. This is a short sermon. I have seen the Lord. 3 people stood in and around this tomb. One of them got there first and hesitatingly entered and started to believe. Another went right in and right out and isn't there yet. And a third lingered in sorrow. But then when she heard her name, she not only was reunited with her Lord, she became the first true Christian in the Scriptures. Did you know that? This is the first conversion that there is in the Bible. She loved Jesus up to this point, but from here forward, she is a converted follower, proclaimer, commissioned disciple. And that's what Easter should be about. It comes to us, and maybe we're in one of those places. Maybe we're kind of like Peter, and we don't know what to do with it yet. Well, there's room, and there's still some time. Maybe we're like John, and we believe, but it seems kind of fuzzy, unclear. But I hope that as we come to this time of response, that we can be like Mary. That we can believe. That we can hear our name called. And not then simply be warmed by the emotion of that reunion and great experience. Because I think we've had a pretty great experience. I have today. But that we might recognize that that experience is a commission to say, He is risen. And the way that we move towards those outside of our walls, the way that we live out loud this resurrected life, the way that we, as those who have believed and been converted, are commissioned to be His followers in this world. He is risen.